Sam, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, I teach New Testament at Knox Theological Seminary. I have a PhD in New Testament from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School under Scott McKnight. Uh, I paid my way through graduate school by working as a magician, so you may have seen me on Nickelodeon. Uh, and I've been teaching at Knox for 25 years now. My specialties are New Testament Greek, textual criticism, and historical Jesus studies.
Cool. So the topic today is the resurrection of Jesus historical. Could you tell me what your position is on that?
Well, being evangelical, of course, I think that it is historical, but it's a complex issue, not made not made more easy by some of the things that evangelicals have done and written over the past few years. Too often, people try to simplify the issue rather than realizing that it is complex, and there are certain uh, things that need to be built up before you can go to talking about the resurrection, for example. One of them is the validity of the historicity of the New Testament. Are these documents reliable? Have they been passed down correctly? Was the New Testament that was written in the first century the same one that we have today, or is it considerably different? All of those are things that are sort of a base level before you can begin to, because much of my argument for the resurrection will be based on certain historical facts that we can get from the resurrection narratives. And I don't make any claim about the inerrancy of the resurrection narratives or anything like that. I'm only claiming that they are basically historically reliable.
Okay, how would so my first concern is that historical testimony doesn't seem to count for anything that doesn't have an empirical basis. So miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFOs. So even if the New Testament was historically reliable, it seems like most historians would reject it on the fact that history isn't allowed to be used to justify new ontologies. You got to have empirical evidence for those things. And so it seems like that on its face kind of eliminates the New Testament from being a reliable basis for miracles.
Yeah, I would disagree. I'm sorry, I have a little bit of a cold. I would disagree with that premise. That is because once you accept that premise that miracles cannot be proven by the written word, then you begin to enter into a non supernatural world in which it seems to me virtually nothing that supernatural can be proven. And Christianity is a supernatural religion. So as a result, the Bible is, in some sense, a book about the supernatural. Tell me a
What
little
do
bit
you?
about yourself, if you don't mind. I'm sorry, I don't know.
Oh, I am an atheist, so I was brought up in Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, read the Bible cover to cover. I've been doing this for about 5 years, full time, 5 years on debating and talking with professors and philosophers on different topics relating to historicity, evidence, philosophy, morality, epistemology, those kind of things. So it's my job right now.
Well, good. Well,
Um,
thanks for having me on.
yeah, absolutely. So when you said that if we don't accept that miracles can be supported through written word, uh, that would imply that we can't have any evidence for miracles. Well, I disagree there because I think we can have empirical evidence of miracles. Like if we discovered miracles today or something, like if we could empirically verify that miracles happen, praying to God cured cancer or something, or
But
regrew a
how would
limb.
we know that? How would we know that for sure, other than the written word?
Well, we'd have scientific papers, so those are written word, but that's fine because those are repeatable.
Well, I'm not, this is not an area of specialty for me, but I'm not sure that a lot of those kinds of things are repeatable. And I think that's one of the places where non-theists start to get themselves in trouble. They sort of think of God as a big concierge in the sky. A lot of people do. And they think that they can just ask him for things and he will just do it for them, when that's not the way that the Bible explains God, and certainly not the way that I've understood praying to him. It's not that he's going to do whatever I ask him like Jim Carrey did.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't require that. I don't think that's important to the argument. So the argument is more like, suppose there was a historical claim that somebody saw unicorns,
Yeah.
Caesar saw a unicorn or whatever. We wouldn't be able to trust that from the document, whatever it was, even if it was a historically accurate document and it was a reliable source or whatever. We wouldn't be able to say that unicorns existed no matter what we read on this document. Nothing on this document could confirm the existence of unicorns. But if later we did some archaeological dig and we found the fossil of a unicorn or something, or the bones of a unicorn, we could then infer, oh, look, there's a unicorn. It did exist. And so it could have actually been seen by Caesar at this time period. And we could infer from its modern day existence, the modern empirical evidence that it did exist, that the historical testimony was then reliable. But until we found that historical confirmation of fossilized unicorn bones, we'd never be able to infer that Caesar actually saw a unicorn simply based off of the historical text. And so the same thing would apply to miracles. If we could confirm miracles existed today in whatever empirical method, doesn't really matter whether or not God would fulfill it or not. If we confirm miracles today, then we could go back and infer that historical testimony of miracles was reliable. But until we have confirmation of miracles today, it seems like it's always going to be more rational to infer that historical documents were fabrications because they didn't know enough about what was going on. There's all the fallacies and biases and illusions and delusions that we know are inherent in the human brain. And so it's far more likely that the case of those documents is a fabrication or a misunderstanding than it is that it actually exists. And so you could never use historical documents to justify miracles, magic, mythical creatures until we have evidence that those things actually exist with our modern scientific basis.
So then we would remain ignorant of the fact that a unicorn actually existed until we found something like the bones. No amount of written record would be enough.
Right.
Yeah, I would disagree with you on that because we trust the written record for all kinds of things in our lives. And I don't think that let's just begin with a few maybe small facts and see whether we can agree on these. Would you agree that Jesus was a person who existed?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that he was killed by the Roman government?
Probably.
Okay. So that's two things that we have that we agree on there. Would you agree that his followers wrote about him rising from the dead?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that it didn't do his followers any good? That is, that they didn't make money off of it. It was dangerous for them to claim that kind of a thing.
Most likely, but in some cases probably not, because there's a lot of evidence that, like, for example, they could have been trying to gain fame or something that could have been an attempt to benefit them, even if it didn't necessarily do so.
So if Jesus died at the hands of the Roman government, he was presumably put into a grave. Would you grant that?
Yeah, I would tend to assume it was a mass grave, though. Yeah.
Okay. So the question then becomes, if you're not willing to accept any written evidence for any kind of miracle, you might want to, there are a couple things I can say might be helpful. One is a set of books by a theologian named Craig Keener, another New Testament scholar. Have you heard of him?
I'm familiar. Yes.
And with that smile, there must be something that I don't know.
Oh yeah. So his book on miracles, I've read a number of his books. So yes, I'm very familiar. I don't remember if I've had him on, but I've definitely invited him and chat with him via email. So yes, I'm very familiar with his work.
And do you find it unsuccessful in its attempt to determine that miracles actually happen?
Yes, extremely unsuccessful. I've gone through it with a number of other academics, and there's been the skeptical approach has been to take the best examples, like the 5 to 10 best examples in all of his work, go through them one by one, and actually see if you can confirm them. And my favorite examples are the ones that, like the hospital in the red shoe, where the person has an NDE and tries to experience. There's a red shoe in another hospital wing, which is fully explained by different psychological features. So we know that when you suddenly lose consciousness, the orientation of your brain is like water pipes that's just left the way it was as soon as it randomly shuts off. And so all of your experiences that are happening through your sense experience are being saved to conscious memory, even though you're not conscious. And so anything that happens, like if you're touched on the arm or if you hear things, the vibrations of your eardrum still happen. The ATP in the cells is still released. And so it still causes a sensation, which is then reflected in the neurons, which is then saved as a memory. And so if someone talks about a red shoe or whatever in the other wing, and you hear that while you're not conscious, that can be saved in your memory as if it were conscious, even though you weren't. And so when you wake up, you'll remember it as if it was a conscious experience, and it wasn't. And that would fully explain the fact that someone could hear something about the red shoe on another wing just by the janitors talking about it passing or whatever, and they could remember it that way, or the doctor's talking about it or whatever. So there's no need for an actual soul experience to explain why someone could gain information or hear things or know what doctors are doing to them when they're out, because all of that is still sensory information that's being sent to the brain. You don't need a heartbeat for that. You don't need brain activity or like EEG brain activity for that. It's all happening simply by the ATP saved in the cells. And so the vast majority of his cases are fully explained by that. Another one is the one where there's somebody who had an NDE and they floated up above their body and they saw a serial number on top of a ventilator in the room. That one was shown to be false because one, ventilators aren't 7 feet tall, they're 4 feet tall. Second, the VIN numbers are never on the top, they're on the side because the mechanics need to be able to inspect the VIN number to inspect the machine and make sure it works to write off that this is a functioning machine. So it's never on the top. And there's a number of other cases. This was the case from when we were trying to find the hospital, the doctors, or the accounts, couldn't find any of that. This traced back to a single professor in a university and their account of this, but we couldn't ever find any of the actual documents relating to this one. So we've gone through, I don't remember what the other ones were because it's been a while, but we've gone through all the best cases that he provided, and they were all extremely better explained by just natural phenomena that we know about in neurology. There's no evidence of actual miracles there.
But I would say that is because of your presupposition. So what Keener has tried to show you is precisely the evidence that you ask for, but you don't accept it when it shows up. And we all have presuppositions that we deal with, and our presuppositions affect the kind of conclusions that we have. And I would say both you and I have certain presuppositions, and they are so drastically different that it would be, unless one of us was willing to do something to sort of tamp that presupposition down, it would be very difficult for us to agree on a lot. Because I would say all of that, what you said, is true about the person in NDE, and I'm skeptical of NDEs. I most of them I don't think are real, though that particular one with the shoe, I mean, there apparently was a shoe there. Now you can resort to, well, she heard about it from somebody else talking about it, but it seems to me that that's you're multiplying causes at that point. The most obvious thing to say, if you have a supernatural worldview, is that somehow life continues on after death. Now, maybe that particular incident doesn't prove it, but I wonder what evidence would it take for you to believe in the resurrection of Jesus?
Novel testable predictions relating to Christianity and God of some kind. But I do want to mention the presuppositions thing. I don't think there are any significant presuppositional differences here. I don't think it's a relevant criticism, because I think that when we're looking at any data, we should always, the rational thing to do is infer the most common cause is the cause of whatever we're seeing. So if you see hoof prints in the snow, if we inferred it was caused by a horse, that's going to be the most rational explanation. And if somebody inferred it's caused by a unicorn, that's always going to be the irrational explanation. There's no presuppositions required, whether you presuppose there's a supernatural or natural world, because we know horses are the most common cause, and we have zero evidence. What?
That's a presupposition that horses are the most common in that particular area, wherever you might be.
Well, this is why I say there's no presuppositional difference, because we would agree that horses are more common than unicorns, right?
We would, yes.
So because we agree that horses are more common than unicorns, if we see a hoof print, horse
Yeah.
is the better explanation.
Right.
And so in the case of miracles, if we're trying to explain a miracle, we would typically both agree neurology, fallacies, biases, illusions, those are more common than miracles, just like horses are more common than unicorns, wouldn't we? We would agree on that one.
Of course. But what would you say, what was the reason for the gospel writers to make up these stories at a danger to themselves? Because they're very early. I mean, that's my area. And the gospels are early. They're before, I would argue, before 60 AD, so, or CE. So there are problems with that. And that is, you have very early testimony from, for example, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. You have very early testimony about the empty tomb, the resurrection, and the number of people who saw him. And it seems to me that Paul is saying this man, resurrected man, was seen by more than 500 people. That he's saying that some of those people are still alive and you can go talk to them. Now, we don't have the opportunity for that kind of empirical evidence because we're historically divided. We're 2,000 years later. But the only thing that we have to tell us about those events is the written word. And that's why I think saying that the written word can never prove a miraculous experience really cuts down on what kind of discussion one can have, because that's a presupposition, it seems to me.
Well, I don't think that's a presupposition. I think that's a rational conclusion based on the reason I provided earlier. That if we know there's something else in the natural world that can cause the phenomenon, that's always going to be the more rational interpretation. So if we see, let's say there's a testimony account of a hoof print or something, we should always include horse. Horse should be the rational conclusion. Or if say there was a historical account of somebody said they saw a unicorn hoof print, we should never believe them. We should never be like, yes, the unicorns exist because this person wrote that they saw a unicorn hoofprint. We should assume, yep, they saw a hoofprint. I grant that part is probably historically accurate, but it was probably caused by a horse and they misinterpreted it because we know the human brain has a bunch of fallacies that would cause that. And so when we look at accounts of the gospel writers writing about people seeing the resurrection of Jesus, we can say, yep, they definitely saw something. They probably believed it. I'm totally happy to grant that. Did they actually see the resurrection? Nope. They probably saw one of the tens of thousands of delusions that we can see happening all over the world of the exact same accounts that we don't believe. So there's a famous account of Santi Sai Baba, Hindu miracle worker who performed miracles in front of tens of thousands of people. They all claimed to have seen him perform miracles right in front of them. Do we believe he actually caused miracles? No, we don't. We think that he's just a con man who is doing parlor tricks. We don't think that we think that all of those people giving those accounts were truthful in what they believed, but they didn't understand enough about reality to be able to differentiate what he was doing from being real magic versus just illusion, parlor tricks, delusion, whatever. Same with the Fatima case, where tens of thousands of people saw the sun move, but half of them saw it, half of them didn't, whatever. And we wouldn't say that the sun actually moved. We'd say these people did see something. That's fine. But it wasn't a miracle. It was a known psychological factor that if you stare at the sun, your brain starts to do a lot of very silly things. And so we can grant the testimony and the authenticity of their belief and say that this is most likely caused by a known phenomenon that is like the horse, that's really common. And this, we would agree that it's more common than actual miracles. And so it seems irrational to say that this would be good evidence of the actual miracle existing, any more so than having somebody write down that they saw a unicorn print would be evidence of unicorns.
I would tend to argue that that might be a little easier to sustain if there were only one gospel. But given the fact that you have the four got the resurrection and Paul talking about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians, you have five different people. The chances of five different people all seeing the same delusion is virtually nil. Mass delusions don't happen. I mean, you can talk about Fatima, but there's a physical reason for that. You stare at the sun. Mass delusions happen at a magic show, but they don't happen at in life very much that I've ever seen or read about.
Well, that's the thing. I've read about quite a lot of them. They're called communal reinforcement. It's where there's some phenomenon that happens that they can't explain. Somebody says, "Ooh, that's aliens," and then everybody else around them, their mind simply globs onto that explanation because the human brain works that way. Where if it's an unknown, someone posits an explanation that fits into your worldview, then you associate whatever the phenomenon was with whatever was attached to your worldview. And that's why the number of UFO sightings drastically increased when UFOs started to be broadcast on radio and TV.
Yeah.
Before they were none, then we saw a bunch of them. And the same thing would apply to the resurrection of Jesus. There's this specific psychological delusion called a bereavement delusion, where if there's someone who's really important to you, could be in a good way or a bad way, it doesn't make a difference. If they die, you will have psychological experiences that will make you think that they're still there. You can touch them, you can see them, you can hear them doing the dishes, whatever they used to do very commonly. And so you'll think they're actually there with you, even though they're not. And this is an extremely common delusion. This happens to like 60% of elderly people who have a dead loved one. It's a massively common delusion. And it is shared. There are shared instances where family members or people who were around the specific individual will have the same kinds of recollections or the same kinds of bereavement delusions because they're based on habit, where this person did something very commonly and you would see a delusion of what you would expect that person to be doing. And this can be shared across family members or people who are familiar with the person. This is extremely common. 60% of elderly people. And so it seems far more likely the combination of those two things, bereavement delusion of seeing visions of the dead loved one, which obviously Jesus was very important to the apostles, so that seems very rational to assume that many of them would likely have that. If 60% of elderly people have experiences, 60% of the apostles would probably have this, very common. And then it's likely that the communal reinforcement could then be applied to the rest of them to expand it to all of them having this, no problem whatsoever. It seems like that's a far more rational explanation.
It could be if the disciples were expecting a resurrection, but the New Testament is very clear in the Gospel of Mark that the disciples did not expect a resurrection, and not just Mark, all of the Gospels. Thomas doesn't believe in it until he touches Jesus, and so they're not expecting a physical resurrection. And given that, it seems to me this would have been more shocking to them than anything else. And Paul hadn't been around Jesus, hated the church, and yet still had some kind of an experience that changed his life.
So I don't know why expecting a resurrection would make a difference there, because people who have bereavement delusions aren't expecting their dead loved one to come back. They have bereavement delusions. What do you mean?
I mean, I would think that a lot of people expect their dead loved ones to come back. You ever listen to Coast to Coast?
The radio show?
Yeah.
Occasionally.
Yeah, well, on open lines, it's like everybody needs inpatient help of an inpatient variety, but there are hundreds of people who call in saying that they've seen their parents show up to them. But that's because they've heard about that on the show or somewhere else. I would argue the disciples hadn't heard about somebody rising from the dead. And as a result of that, that is exactly what they didn't do. They thought that they were a failure. And that's the reason that Peter starts fishing again. He's not going off fishing for fun. He's going back to his job because he bet on the wrong Messiah. It was the wrong guy. And there are lots of messiahs in the first century. But intriguingly, only one of them has a Christian church named after him. The rest of them died and pretty much went away. So it seems to me that there must be something special. These documents and things like the Sermon on the Mount, these are not, it seems to me, things that are off the cuff like that.
Well, I agree they weren't made off the cuff, but like bereavement delusion happens to everybody, scientists, philosophers, atheists, everybody, because it's not, your expectations don't really make a difference here. It's about the fact that your brain has been primed with particular inputs because of neuroplasticity, that you've experienced this person for many years. They're very important to you. They have shaped your brain in various ways. So when they die, there can be residual kinds of stimulus that caused those parts of your brain to activate and make you think that you're hearing them, seeing them, touching them again. And it has nothing to do with expectation. Expectation is completely irrelevant. It's just neuroplasticity. Your brain has been developed in such a way that this person has such an active input on your neuroplasticity that residual things can cause it to fire, to cause you to have the past experiences again. Because when you imagine something happening, the parts of your brain that activate are the exact same parts that activate when the actual experience is occurring. And so this doesn't have anything to do with expectation. I don't know if expectation has an impact on whether it happens more or less often, but we know bereavement delusion happens to like 60% of the population, whether or not you believe in souls. It's just an extremely common phenomenon. And so it doesn't seem like that would be a relevant criticism to my argument, because this would apply whether or not they were expecting it.
Yeah, I think we've met sort of at the point of our difference here, and that is, I would say that the fact that many of the disciples were killed, and I know that there's question about how many of them, and it's a historical problem, but at least some of them were killed. Wouldn't it have been easier for them to say, "Hey, we didn't really see Jesus. This
Sure.
was all, we just made all this up." But they
Sure.
didn't. The Apostle Paul didn't. The Peter didn't. So that seems to me to be a fairly strong argument to the fact that they believed with everything they had that Jesus had actually risen from the dead. They were not expecting him to rise from the dead. That was not what messiahs did. They expected the Messiah to come in and overthrow the Roman government. And as a result, John the Baptist was disappointed with Jesus' ministry. The disciples were disappointed with Jesus' ministry. The last thing they would have expected is him to come back from the dead, because they just didn't listen to what he had to say. The Gospel of Mark is very clear in showing us that the disciples just have every reason in the world to believe, and yet they don't until finally, as a result of the resurrection. So I would argue that these documents are basically historically reliable, that we can take basic facts from the Gospels. We don't have to take everything of the whole story. And we can say Jesus existed, Jesus died, and they believe, these people writing these documents believe that Jesus rose from the dead. If we can't ever use written documentation to prove a miracle, then we are at odds. I don't see any way around that, because we're not going to get any other kind of evidence for a 2,000-year-old claim.
Well, sure. So, but let's grant that that's true. If the apostles did have a bereavement delusion after Jesus died, and communal reinforcement causing them all to share this delusion, I would expect them to believe it. So I would expect them, because they don't know what bereavement delusions are. They don't have access to modern neurology. They don't have access to polling data of how often this happens. This would be a very profound experience for them. They would be very emotionally affected by it, because the person who, especially if he did actually claim that he was going to rise in 3 days and they had it, that'd be really impressive. I would be really impressed. Back then, I would probably believe it. In which case, I think it would be rational for them to proselytize about this event, even at the risk of their own life. So I think that the fact that they genuinely believed it would be completely consistent with the fact it was a delusion, but because they didn't know about delusions, this would have such a profound emotional impact on them. It would be equivalent if it actually happened. And so I wouldn't expect any difference in their actions, whether or not it was a real event or if it was a psychological manifestation that they just didn't understand, because they would probably believe it was a real event either way. And so I would agree they genuinely believed it and would be willing to die for it, because it was probably an extremely profound experience to have a bereavement delusion of a person who claimed to be God and said they were going to rise from the dead. So, but I don't see why their belief would be more indicative of it being real than it being a psychological delusion, because it seems like either way, as long as they didn't know about the psychological delusion, they would have the same action or reaction. And then I can grant the possibility of miracles. I'm happy to grant the possibility of miracles, but it seems like when looking at historical documents, the more rational conclusion is like it's going to be explained by the natural phenomenon we know about. So like if we have an account of a horse horse print in the snow, it's always going to be more rational to say a horse did it rather than a unicorn did it, because we have so much evidence of horses. Like, it's so prevalent. This is a really common phenomenon. Bereavement delusion, extremely common phenomenon. And so when someone says they saw a dead loved one, I don't know what evidence they could provide in the document itself to make it more likely that this was a actual vision of a dead loved one versus a bereavement delusion. I don't know if that's even possible. Like, if someone take the example of the hoof print. If someone saw a hoof print in the snow or saw a horse that they thought was a unicorn, what could they possibly write into the document to make it rational to believe in unicorns actually existing, rather than it just being a horse and then being not understanding that?
But at that point, let's say that, just for the sake of arguments, that a few unicorns did exist. The only way that we would ever find out about them, if they only existed 2,000 years ago, is by the written word. And I agree with you. We do have to be skeptical about written words, particularly written words from the early 2,000 years ago. But I think that the Gospels are a different kind of literature. And having studied them for a large part of my life, it seems to me that I don't know how I could show you anything to overcome this idea that the text is not strong enough to prove a miracle.
Well, what do you mean by different kind of literature, and what would you need to change or add to my unicorn example to make it reasonable for you to believe unicorns existed? Like, what would you need to see in a document to make unicorns or UFOs or something rational to believe based on historical testimony from 2,000 years ago?
Well, in terms of different literature, like the Greek New Testament, particularly the Gospels, is different from like Herodotus. They don't put out these crazy, wild stories about ants digging for gold and stuff like that, and people with one foot that goes backwards, stuff like that. I would say that the vast majority of what is included in the Gospels are stories about a man going around teaching wonderful things. And the fact that he rose from the dead indicates that he is who he claimed to be. Now, all of that is based on the text. And if the text is never strong enough to overcome a presupposition against miracles, or at least statistically, it's never strong enough to overcome that, then it seems that there's no way that you could ever believe in the resurrection. There's no evidence that exists that would be strong enough.
Well, I think that's the rational conclusion based on historical testimony. I think we could justify it if, like, we could show modern miracles existed. Like, if Craig Keener could do a peer-reviewed paper where praying to Jesus regrew limbs, and we could videotape it or something, then that would be great evidence of miracles. And then you could infer that miracles in the Bible or Christianity were true in that case.
Even if that happened, wouldn't you rightly say, I'm skeptical of what Keener has to say, and I'm skeptical of this videotape?
If we had peer-reviewed repeatable papers, no, I'd be like, that's science. If you can science it and show it actually happened, I'm happy to grant it at that point.
Aren't peer-reviewed repeatable papers proven wrong fairly often?
I don't know what you mean by fairly often. Like, they're the most reliable source of data we have. Like, there isn't a more reliable source. So are they occasionally proven wrong? Yes. Are there new evidence supported? Yes. But they're the most reliable form of evidence that we know of in the universe, as far as I know.
I would tend to say that again goes to your worldview, and that is, I'm not sure that science is the most reliable form of truth in the world, in that there are lots of things that science can't test. And science can't tell us whether we have a soul. Science can't tell us what exactly is the mind-body problem and how does it all fit together. They can make certain philosophical guesses at it, but they're never going to be able to finally tell us, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I'm very
just to clarify,
experience. Go ahead.
Those seem like two different claims. Like, the first claim is that science is the most reliable source of knowledge that we have. And the second claim is whether or not science can tell us everything. I mean, I agree science doesn't have an answer for everything. Fully happily agree with that one. But I don't know that there's any other method of gaining knowledge that's more reliable than science. So I think that I would agree with both of those statements, and I don't see them as contradictory. Like, if you disagree that science is the most reliable form of knowledge that we have, what would be another one that's more reliable?
Well, I would say God speaking to us, but that's because I'm a Christian. And so that goes to my own presuppositions
Well,
about.
how would you evaluate that to be as reliable as science? Like, I would say that if it was the case that God speaking to us was more reliable than science, then we should be able to use that to make scientific discoveries or make discoveries that science hasn't been able to make before it makes it. So, like,
Yeah.
if God talking to us is more reliable, we'd be able to say mathematicians could get mathematical solutions from God, or physicists should be able to get solutions from God and then discover it in science. But that seems to have never happened. It seems to be the other way around, where we'll get scientific discoveries and then theologians will try to get messages from God after the fact confirming this, or make that fit their worldview. But it never seems to go the other way around, where knowledge given from God's word is then confirmed by science.
Well, I'm not sure about that, because let's take a fairly heated example among fundamentalism, and that is the days of creation, 7 24-hour days. Well, we know that's highly unlikely, just highly unlikely. And it wasn't modernism that came to tell us that that's highly unlikely. It was Augustine back in the 3rd and 4th century saying God doesn't need 7 24-hour days. He can create the whole world in an instant if he wants to. So this time must mean something else besides pieces of 24 hours. So I think that there are cases where theologians have led the pack instead of the scientists. Now, I'm not a scientist, so but I do know Augustine and people like that. But your point is well taken, that we can't, it's not as if God, again, is our concierge and we just ask him for whatever we want and he gives it to us. And that's the reason that I think many of these tests about things like prayer and, near-death experiences, I think that they don't work. There's always going to be some kind of a problem with them. You might remember, it's been a while now, maybe 15 or 20 years, there was an experiment where there was a computer monitor facing the ceiling in hospitals, and they wanted to see whether or not a person claiming a near-death experience could tell them what was on that computer monitor, because no one else would know. It would be switching pictures all the time. Well, skeptics, and I remember this particularly from the Skeptical Inquirer magazine, were really upset about that and said it's unethical. You can't be doing that. And I don't know why. I mean, if we're after truth, why not?
Yeah, I'm all for it. Go for it. Test it in every way we can. I think that's a great idea. I don't agree with Michael Shermer on a lot of things. I don't think he's a scientist in many ways. He's a journalist.
Yeah, that's a different magazine. That one's called Skeptic, but then there's a Skeptical Inquirer.
Which one is that?
It's,
who runs that?
It's much older. It was run by James Randi at one point, and the typical skeptics that you might expect. Penn writes in it, from Penn and Teller. One of the things I really like about you and Penn is that we can have a rational conversation without speaking badly about each other or thinking badly of one another. And that's how we get to truth, isn't it? By speaking to people with whom we disagree and try to figure out, okay, what would it take to convince you of my position, and what would it take for you to convince me of my position, you to convince me of your position? I think both of those are very, very significant questions, because I've asked myself on a number of occasions, what would it take for me to give up Christianity, which I think is a significant question. If someone were to be able to prove the resurrection never happened, I would give up Christianity. The problem, of course, is it's the same with documents not being able to prove the miraculous. there's not going to be a foolproof discovery that proves that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. That's just not going to happen. And as a result of that, we're then left with the evidence that we have. I find it compelling. You don't. And I think that some of that is because of the way that we come at the question.
Well, I partially agree there, but my question that I'm more interested in isn't what would get you to stop believing in Christianity. I think you should be able to believe in Christianity whether or not there's evidence. So that part isn't what I think is most important. What I think is most important is what would get you to stop believing that the historical documents are sufficient reason to believe the resurrection happened. Because that's the thing that I think is rationally, it's not justified to believe based on historical documentations for the reasons I described. That we don't think that when there is a natural explanation that already explains the data fully and it's more prevalent and more common, this should always be the rational explanation. Like if we see a hoof print in the snow or we see a hoof print in a historical document, we should always infer horse, always horse, until there's like modern empirical evidence that unicorns existed, even one. Then we can infer maybe it was a unicorn and there's a rational basis for that. But until we have evidence of the unicorn, that seems like we should always go horse. Horse is the best explanation here. But in the theologian's case, that doesn't seem to be what they're doing. They seem to be adding, nope, it's the unicorn. Even if we don't have any empirical evidence of unicorns today, we're still going to infer it's a unicorn just based off of what's in the text. And that part I find very dubious, because I think that if I just gave you could make up whatever textual document you wanted with anything in it you wanted. I don't know of anything you could write that could make it rational to believe there was actually a unicorn back then. I don't think you could just write anything. If I gave you any document you wanted, you could just poof it into existence. What could you possibly write that could make unicorns rational to believe? I don't know if you could. And so it's what I don't understand is why theologians seem to put more merit into historical testimony than they should, and only in the case of their religious belief. Because obviously, if you ask a Hindu, they're going to believe the Hindu miracles, but not the Christian miracles. If you ask a Muslim, they're going to believe the Muslim miracles, not the Christian miracles. But I think that the more rational interpretation, disregarding presuppositions, just based off of if we were logic, rational computer machines, what is the rational interpretation of how should we treat historical documents? It seems like the rational way to treat it is the way that most historians and most legal experts do, that testimony is never sufficient for anything that lacks an empirical basis. So miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, any court cases where those are brought up are thrown out. They're not taken seriously because they don't have any precedent, the technical term precedent. You need some basis that these things actually exist in empirical reality before they can be attributed in a court case or in a historical document. That seems to be, from my perspective, the rational way to interpret history and law. And I think if there was a perfect rational computer, that's probably the way it would do it. I don't think it's based off presuppositions. I think it's based off of just probability based on evidence, and that's the way it should be. And I'm wondering what it would take for you and other theologians to get to that point and see that as the more rational interpretation of history.
I would say that if you grant that, you're on the way to becoming historical agnostic. Because if you can't believe the best document that we have, the most well-preserved document from the ancient world that we have, and that we have good evidence that they believed what they were writing, then there's nothing at this point that could prove the resurrection to you, is there?
From historical documents, no, but I think I'd apply that equally to all historical documents. The Hindu miracles of Santi Sai Baba, the miracle of Fatima, the UFO sightings, the Bigfoot sightings, the origin of Rome being Romulus and Remus being raised by a wolf. I would apply this to every single case of miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFOs. And that seems to give me the most accurate basis of history, an understanding of history that I could possibly get. The one that gives me the most true beliefs and the fewest false beliefs. But if you add in this extra criterion that allows in some set of circumstances, these are justifiable to believe based off of historical documents, it seems that opens the door to a whole bunch of false beliefs. And there's no way to adjudicate which ones of these are the correct and incorrect ones, because the people writing them all believe them. They believe, or vast majority, they believe that they saw this thing. It's extremely common that humans believe that they see supernatural experiences. It's happens all the time. Most people think they have supernatural experiences. So that part is just universal. They all believe it for the most part. And even if it's a historian, because even historians back then had a tendency to write in mystical things, like Pliny and the Tacitus, and they were writing like things about Romulus and Remus being raised by wolves into their historical documents. And we don't think that was happening. We don't trust them. They're extremely the best historians of the time, who are the most trustworthy, wrote in miracles, and we're like, nah, didn't happen. We're going to exclude that part. We can get everything else, take out the miracles. And it seems like when we do that, we get a much more accurate, clear, reliable understanding of history.
But how would you know? How would you know for sure? Because maybe those miracles really did happen, and the only evidence we have is the written text. So how do we know for sure that that's giving us the most accurate view of the world?
Well, we don't know if it did or didn't happen. So it's possible it did happen. But I think that if we allow in the possibility for all of the different claims, because there's millions of miracle claims, the probability that any one of them is true is so low that if we accept this criterion, we'd necessarily be letting in more false things than true things. We wouldn't be able to tell which ones are the false ones and which ones are the true ones. And so we take that the historical standard that we'd rather have one innocent man go free than 100 guilty men, whatever. I forget what the quote is, but the same principle in history, that we would rather eliminate or not trust this method because it would unreliably let in too many false things, even if one of them happens to be true. And so we should hold the standard because it opens the door to too many false things, and we have no way to tell which ones are the true ones and which ones are the false ones based on this criteria.
The question that I would have is, what if one of those miracles were indeed the most important historical event in the history of the world? Your method would not allow us to know about that, and as a result, we would be ignorant of some significant piece of history. Wouldn't that be?
Go ahead.
Wouldn't that be fair? That anything that seems miraculous that's written down in an ancient document didn't happen. That would be your go-to position.
Well, I wouldn't say seems miraculous. It doesn't have an empirical basis in reality. So specifically,
right? So stories of unicorns and Bigfoot and whatever.
Yep.
Those kind of things. You're just going to say it didn't happen. No matter that Roger Patterson had a film of Bigfoot in 1967 in Bluff Creek, you just don't care because it's fake. It's just fraudulent. And Roger Patterson was a guy who liked to fool around with people. And if it weren't for the Patterson film, we wouldn't have Bigfoot today. But I would say that the evidence for the resurrection is a different kind, in that we have very strongly preserved historical document. We have a very strongly studied historical document. For the last 2,000 years, the New Testament's been studied by a variety of people. And there are a number of people in the world who say that this is the most important event in the history of the world. What I wonder is what can you do to prevent yourself? And the same question could be asked of me. I might be believing in a fairy tale and wasting my life. What kind of evidence could we get to that would help us both to avoid either one of those ends to our lives?
Well, so the first thing is the importance question. Like, I don't know if importance matters. So, like, for example, if we have a set of 4 or 5 different methodologies, one is using science or whatever, and one is flipping a coin. Say we have a really important question or a really simple question. To me, it doesn't seem like, because the question is really, really important, it's okay to use the coin flipping. It seems like that's a terrible, terrible explanation. We shouldn't be like, it's okay to flip a coin if it's a really important question. It seems like what matters is the reliability of the methodology. The reliability of the methodology is what we should use to answer both the most important question and the least important question. It doesn't matter the importance. What matters is what's the reliability of the methodology. And my analysis of historical testimony is more like coin flipping. It's a bad methodology. It can't differentiate which ones are the real ones and which ones are the false ones. Even if we assume that there were real ones, this method wouldn't be able to tell us which ones are which. And so it's like coin flipping. And so whether or not it's a really, really important question or just a simple mundane question, we would either way, we would still use the more reliable methodology rather than the coin flipping. And so that would be the first thing. I don't think that the importance of the question matters. The second thing is what can we do to eliminate false beliefs and make it more rational? I would say that we would have to test more about the ideology today. And if we can confirm it today, like the Craig Keener methodology, his attempt to demonstrate miracles is the correct thing to do. I think that if we could demonstrate miracles scientifically today, then it would be completely rational to infer that those miracles happened in the past. I think that Craig Keener's method doesn't work. I think that's the consensus among everybody in every field he talks to: neurology, psychology, cognitive science, medical science. The methodology he's using doesn't work. I think he should use a more strict, peer-reviewed, double-blind things that would actually demonstrate miracles exist. And when we do that, it doesn't work. There's no positive evidence of miracles from doing those kinds of tests. But if Craig Keener could do that in a double-blind peer review, I think that would provide a sufficient basis to infer that miracles happen. And then once we could show miracles happen today, we could infer in the past that whatever the context is, so if it's like pray to God, pray to Christianity to get the miracles to happen, then you could infer people who did it in the past could also have had the same result. And you can say that historical testimony is more likely to be true of miracles in Christianity than of Hinduism or whatever. And so I think that the Craig Keener method is the right method. You just needs to do it in a more scientific way with peer-reviewed, double-blind, repeatable studies. And if you could do it that way, then you could infer miracles in the past and Christianity happened.
But you can't expect the Gospels to do a peer-reviewed double-blind study. You can't expect Matthew to footnote in Turabian format.
Oh, right. Just to clarify, I mean, today,
I know
I'm
you're
not
talking about Keener, but
yeah.
The point is that's what they had. What else could Matthew have done to convince you of the resurrection?
Oh yeah, I don't think there's anything Matthew could have done. Maybe there is. Maybe like if he made predictions about science. We said God rose from the dead, and he told me DNA is a double helix, and he told me the universe is 13.8 billion years old, and he told me that the CMB will see a difference of 0.25 degrees Kelvin, whatever. If you made all of those predictions, I think that then it might be rational to believe based on the historical document. But other than making those kinds of future predictions in science, I don't think there's anything he could have written down that could have done it. I don't like, because my argument is that if we could do the peer-reviewed stuff today and show that unicorns existed, then it would be rational to infer the testimony of unicorns was reliable. But so I don't think I would expect Matthew to actually do the peer review. I don't know. That's fine. We can just accept the documents as they are, and they could be rational to accept if today we could show miracles existed or unicorns existed, that people in the past experienced these things in reality, as opposed to them being a figment of our imagination.
Let me ask you a couple questions. I have class in a little while, so I'll probably have to cut out at about an hour. But let me ask you, given the fact that there's nothing else that Matthew could have done, you're willing to say it's possible that Jesus rose from the dead. It's possible that he was God. It's possible that the Hebrew Bible did predict some things about him. And the evidence is just not strong enough for me. So if by chance there is a God and you stood before him, you would say the same thing that Bertrand Russell would say: why didn't you give me more evidence?
Yes. Well, I'd have some moral questions for him, like drowning babies in the Bible or whatever. But yes, I would say that there is not sufficient evidence to make it rational to believe based on the evidence that there is such a being. And so I didn't. Yes, that's what I would say.
And there are, this is not my area, but just there are those who would argue that belief in God is necessarily presuppositional to do anything. And you know, it's not my argument, so don't. But
I'm very, very familiar with presuppositional apologetics. I've had a number of them on. Yes,
I'm not very thrilled with a lot of that, but you know, it is what it is. It seems to me that we've come to a place where we see what our differences are, and maybe we can meet again another time and talk about more about this philosophical conundrum that we find ourselves in, whether or not ancient documents can ever tell us something that is supernatural and we are rational in believing it. It seems like that's where we've come to, isn't it, in this time that we've spent together?
Yeah, for sure.
And so I think that given that, maybe we should set up another time to meet. I've had a wonderful time here. I think this is a great thing to meet and speak together and really listen to one another. I think it's what the world needs a lot more of. And it's been a great time for me. And I'd be glad to come back and talk about that maybe some other time.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you coming on. It was a really enjoyable conversation. I do want to give you the opportunity to give any links or references for people can find out more about your work.
I'm not famous or anything. I have one book about Greek grammar that nobody really wants to read. Students buy it. So it's, you can look up some of my stuff on knoxseminary.edu if you want some stuff on YouTube, but it's not, there's some scholarly stuff on there, but it's mostly popular level kinds of things. And I think this is true for all of us. We say things with more conviction when we're speaking to a crowd of our brothers and sisters. And sometimes when we're speaking to a person who disagrees with us, it forces us to be much more precise in the way that we lay out the argument.
Definitely. I think that talking to people you disagree with is the best way to learn anything, because they've learned about their position and the weaknesses in yours, and you've learned about your position and the weaknesses in theirs. And so discussing and poking holes in each other's position is the best way to grow in both sides.
Yeah. And I haven't convinced many, if any, of the listeners, but that's okay. Hopefully they've listened, and it's okay. We've all learned, and it's a good thing. It's been a wonderful conversation. It's been very pleasant for me to get to know you a little bit more, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Absolutely. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. And I'll sorry I can't stay longer, but as I said, it's the last day of class today, so I've got to get there.
Yep.
All right.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
Talk to you
Thank
later.
you so much for having me. So long.